Imagine the world of professional cycling, a sport defined by speed, precision, and grit. Now, imagine this world, dominated by one particular stereotype for decades. The belief that it was a sport for the elite, the privileged, the white. But what if I told you there was one race, one defining moment in history, where that perception was not only challenged but completely shattered? This isn't just any race. This was an event that would change the narrative, break down walls of prejudice, and prove that anyone, from any background, could not only compete, but thrive in the cycling world. Welcome to the story of the race that shattered racism in the biking world. To understand the significance of this moment, we need to go back. Back to a time when cycling races were often seen as exclusive, an arena where the color of your skin, the sound of your name, or your upbringing determined your place at the table. For decades, the professional biking world seemed almost untouchable, with barriers that discouraged diversity and reinforced stereotypes. Many people of color were discouraged from participating, not necessarily because of lack of talent, but because of a harsh, discriminatory system that favored a very specific image of a cyclist. If you weren't from the right socioeconomic class, if you weren't from a cycling-rich heritage, you were often overlooked, sidelined, or shut out. But then, something incredible began to happen. Small pockets of resistance started to form. Talented individuals, against all odds, pushed themselves forward, defying expectations and challenging the status quo. They trained in secret, took to the streets, and fought for their right to race alongside the elite. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick. The journey was long, and there were countless obstacles along the way. But through sheer will and determination, a movement was building. And that movement would culminate in one race, one moment that would go down in history as the turning point. At the center of this story is a cyclist, a young athlete who grew up in an underrepresented community, someone who faced all the odds stacked against them, but had the heart and the skill to prove the world wrong. This athlete knew the history, knew the challenges, and yet, with each pedal stroke, they showed that cycling wasn't just for the wealthy or the well-connected. It was for anyone with the passion and drive to push through. This individual's journey wasn't just about crossing a finish line. It was about breaking chains, confronting prejudice head-on, and sending a powerful message to the entire world of cycling. This sport belongs to everyone, but it wasn't just their victory. It became a symbol for a movement, a beacon for young cyclists of all backgrounds, who for the first time felt they had a place in this world. A world that had once told them they didn't belong. And then came the day of the race. The stage was set. The anticipation in the air was thick, the atmosphere electric. The audience didn't just want to see who would win. They were waiting to see if history would repeat itself or if a new chapter would be written. On one side, you had the well-established names, the veterans of the sport, the ones who had trained on the top-tier bikes, under the best coaches, with sponsors lining their pockets. On the other side, you had the underdogs, the athletes who had fought tooth and nail just to be there. It wasn't just about the race itself, it was about what it represented. It was a battle for equality, for acceptance, and for the right to be seen as more than just the color of your skin or the neighborhood you grew up in. The race was a spectacle, the competition fierce. As the athletes took to the track, you could feel the weight of history in every turn of the pedals. The crowd cheered, the commentators buzzed, and the tension was palpable. But one question hung in the air. Could the underdog, the one who had spent years proving their worth, really pull off a victory against the cycling giants? Could this race, this one moment, change everything? With each lap, the athletes pushed harder. But as the final stretch approached, the unthinkable happened. The underdog, the one everyone had written off, was right there, neck and neck with the elite. The crowd went silent. Would they fall short, or would they become the symbol of an entire movement? This wasn't just about winning the race. It was about something much larger. It was about showing the world that the game was changing. And then, the bell rang. But you'll have to wait for the next chapter to find out what happened next. The final seconds were filled with suspense, with everything hanging in the balance. Could this race really shatter the long-standing biases in the biking world? Or would it end up being just another momentary spark that faded away? Stay tuned, because the story is far from over. What happens next will leave you on the edge of your seat, and the entire cycling world will never be the same again. As the race continued to unfold, the tension in the air only grew stronger. With every pedal stroke, the underdog, a young cyclist named Marcus, was proving himself. He wasn't just racing against the clock or the seasoned veterans of the sport. He was racing against a system that had long pushed people like him to the margins. Marcus didn't come from a privileged background. He grew up in a working-class neighborhood where the idea of professional cycling seemed like an impossible dream. There were no fancy coaches, no high-end bikes, no sponsors waiting to sign him. But Marcus had something far more powerful: a relentless determination to prove that cycling wasn't just a sport for the elite. It was a sport for anyone willing to put in the work, regardless of where they came from. Marcus's journey to this race had been long and difficult. From the moment he first picked up a bike, he faced constant skepticism from both peers and outsiders. "Cycling's not for people like you," they'd say. "You won't make it past the first mile." But Marcus didn't listen. Every comment, every sneer, only fueled his desire to keep going. He trained on old second-hand bikes that most would have discarded. He relied on the knowledge he gathered from online videos, local mechanics, and the few friends who believed in him. He didn't have the luxury of a formal team, but what he lacked in resources, he made up for in heart. Each race he entered, he fought tooth and nail to prove he belonged. But no matter how hard he pushed, the cycling world seemed to be just out of reach. Until now. The moment Marcus qualified for this prestigious event, it felt like a victory in itself. But he knew it was far from over. In fact, the real battle was just beginning. The race had drawn the attention of the cycling world, and the stakes were higher than ever. The media was buzzing, the sponsors were watching, and the spectators filled the stands, eager to witness history. There was an undeniable sense of expectation hanging over the race, not just for the competitors, but for the entire sport. This wasn't just about winning. It was about reshaping the future of cycling. And Marcus was determined to be the one to do it. As the race progressed, it was clear that the biggest threat to Marcus was not just the top-tier athletes, but the ingrained mindset that still permeated the sport. Among his toughest competitors was Jared, a cyclist with years of experience, a polished team, and the backing of major sponsors. Jared's name was synonymous with winning. He had the reputation, the accolades, and the resources that most cyclists only dreamed of. To him, this race was just another opportunity to solidify his place in history. But to Marcus, it represented the chance to change everything. Jared had heard the whispers about Marcus, the underdog who had managed to gain attention from people who usually didn't even notice riders like him. He didn't believe it. To him, Marcus was nothing more than a fleeting curiosity. Jared had seen countless races come and go, their hopes dashed after the first real challenge. But as they both powered through the grueling laps, something shifted. Marcus wasn't fading away like he expected. In fact, he was getting closer, gaining on him with each turn. Behind the scenes, tensions were mounting. The cycling world, particularly the elite circles, had a lot riding on this race. If Marcus won, it would shatter decades of tradition and open the floodgates for athletes from diverse backgrounds to enter the sport. It wasn't just about a race anymore. It was about power, control, and the very identity of cycling. There were whispers in the corridors, discussions in hushed tones about how a victory for Marcus could change the sponsorship landscape, the media narrative, and the very structure of professional cycling. Some supported him, seeing this as a necessary shift, while others feared it. Fear of what it would mean for their carefully curated image of the sport. Fear of change. The race was nearing its final laps, and Marcus was locked in a fierce battle with Jared. The crowd was on edge, watching in disbelief as the underdog not only kept up, but seemed to be gaining momentum. The veterans of the sport, who had grown accustomed to winning, were now questioning whether they had underestimated Marcus's determination and skill. But as the final stretch approached, something unexpected happened. Just as Marcus was about to pass Jared, something went wrong. His front tire hit a small pothole, something that would have been easy to miss by most racers, but not someone with the attention to detail that Marcus had developed through years of training. The jolt threw him off balance for just a split second, enough for Jared to pull ahead. The crowd gasped as Marcus fought to regain control, but Jared was now in the lead, heading toward the final stretch. The gap was widening, but Marcus wasn't giving up. Despite the setback, he pushed harder, determined to close the gap. He knew the race wasn't over until it was over. But with every passing second, the weight of the situation began to sink in. If he couldn't catch up, if he couldn't break through this final barrier, then everything he had fought for, everything the underrepresented cyclists had fought for, might slip through his fingers. It wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It was about every cyclist who had ever been told they didn't belong. It was about every person who had ever been told their dream was too big, too impossible. The world was watching, and the tension was unbearable. Would Marcus be able to close the gap in time, or would Jared hold on to his lead, preserving the status quo and sending the message that things were staying the same? As the finish line drew closer, the clock ticking down, it was clear that this wasn't just a race between two cyclists. It was a race for the future of cycling itself. And what happened in these final moments would determine whether the sport would remain the same or whether a new era would begin. The final moments of the race felt like an eternity. As Marcus fought to regain his momentum, every muscle in his body screamed for relief. The finish line loomed ahead, a mere blur in the distance. Jared, with his years of experience and perfectly tuned bike, was inching closer to the finish line. But Marcus wasn't backing down. His heart raced, not just from the physical exertion, but from the realization that this was more than just a race. This was his moment to change everything. In the crowd, a wave of mixed emotions rippled. Some fans were cheering for the seasoned pro Jared, while others were starting to realize that something incredible was happening before their eyes. For the first time, it wasn't clear who would win. Jared, the favored champion, had no idea what was about to unfold. He was so focused on the finish that he failed to notice Marcus, inching closer with every lap. But Marcus knew something Jared didn't. The final stretch of the race wasn't just about speed. It was about heart. And in that moment, Marcus's heart was everything. As they approached the final corner, Marcus saw an opening. Jared had taken the turn too wide, just slightly out of position. It was small, almost insignificant to most, but to Marcus, it was everything. This was his chance, the one he'd been working for, the one moment that would define his entire career. With a burst of energy that seemed to come from deep within, Marcus made his move. He cut through the corner like a pro, his bike leaning into the curve with perfect precision. The crowd gasped, the tension building with every second. Jared's face twisted in surprise as he saw Marcus closing in on him, pushing the pace with every pedal stroke. It wasn't just the strength of his legs that propelled Marcus forward. It was the weight of his dreams, the hopes of countless others who had believed in him. As the final meters ticked away, Marcus surged ahead. The finish line was within reach, and the roar of the crowd seemed to push him forward. Jared tried to catch up, but it was too late. In a final, explosive effort, Marcus crossed the finish line, leaving Jared behind. The crowd erupted into cheers, but for Marcus, it was more than just a victory. It was a statement. A statement that cycling was for everyone, that no dream was too big, and no barrier too high to overcome. The cameras flashed, capturing the moment for history. Marcus stood there, gasping for breath, his body aching, but his heart full. He had done it. Against all odds, He had not only won the race, but had shattered the long-standing belief that cycling was a sport reserved for a select few. The race wasn't just a victory for Marcus. It was a victory for every cyclist who had ever been overlooked, every athlete who had been told they didn't belong. In the aftermath, the cycling world was buzzing. Headlines across the globe were writing about the race that had changed everything. People were no longer questioning whether a person of color could excel in the sport. They were celebrating it. Marcus's victory had opened doors for so many others, proving that talent knows no boundaries and that anyone with the heart to compete could make it to the top. Sponsorships began to shift, with more diverse athletes being given the opportunities they deserved. The media landscape started to change, with stories about underrepresented cyclists now being front and center. But Marcus's journey didn't end with that victory. It was only the beginning. He knew that his success wasn't just about winning a race. It was about paving the way for others. He started mentoring young cyclists from all walks of life, helping them navigate the obstacles that had once stood in his way. It wasn't just about teaching them how to race. It was about teaching them to believe in themselves and fight for their place in the sport. And so the cycling world began to transform. The barriers that had once held so many back started to crumble, one race at a time. Marcus's victory became a symbol, a reminder that change was possible, that the race to equality, the race to representation, was one that could be won. The world of professional cycling would never be the same again. As for Marcus, he remained grounded, aware of the responsibility he now carried. He wasn't just a champion. He was a trailblazer. The race that shattered racism in the biking world had set a new course for the future, a future where anyone, regardless of their background, could dream big and ride toward their goals. His story wasn't just about cycling. It was about resilience, about breaking down walls, and about showing the world that everyone deserves a chance to race, to shine, and to be seen. And as Marcus rode off into the sunset, the echoes of that historic race, the race that shattered racism in the biking world, would continue to inspire generations to come.